Dr. Gordon Belharry, retired chairman of the Department of Religion from Walla Walla College, presents our Sermon of the Month, entitled, Getting Things Together.
Our topic this morning, Getting Things Together. Our scripture passage from John the 6th chapter. Our main structure, big things and little things. The sermon today really concerns the feeding of the 5,000, one of the great miracles that Christ performed. In fact, it's so great that there are more verses devoted to this miracle than any other of the 33 miracles that Christ performed, which are recorded. Apparently, the Bible writers considered it pretty important. Another unique feature about it is that it is recorded in all four Gospels, and no other miracle has that distinction, the feeding of the 5,000. Let me read from John the 6th chapter, verse 12. And they all ate and were satisfied. And he told his disciples, gather up the fragments that nothing be lost. And they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over, is the way one version puts it. The broken pieces left over. First, we're concerned with some big things in relation to this miracle. The big things, of course, would be the crowd, about 5,000 altogether. I sometimes wonder if the Bible hasn't introduced just a little bit of irony here and there, because in some versions it says that Jesus and his disciples decided to go into a lonely place. And it says, so they went into a lonely place with 5,000 people following them all the way. In fact, it may have been more than 5,000. It says 5,000 men besides the women and children. So there could have been 10, 12, 15,000 altogether that followed them out here into this lonely place. Now, of course, we have a big crowd then, say 12,000 or thereabout. That's one big problem. The next one, of course, was the question of food. Because Jesus had been preaching to these people, and they got hungry, just about the way you folks do this time of day, and therefore hope the sermon will be short. The word food is the next big problem, but in a sense that's not really the key word either. The key word is the word compassion. Because food for the disciples simply meant, look, why don't we have the benediction, tell them all to go home and find their own food? Why should we hope, to feed all these people? Just tell them that we're glad they came, and give them a friendly handshake and wish them God's blessing and tell them to go on home. Well, that's the way the disciples felt about it, but of course Jesus, with him that word compassion comes in capital letters, and he says, what are we going to do about these people? They're hungry. What to do? Well, get some help. Now, Philip was there, and Jesus looked at Philip, and he said, Philip, how about bringing on the supper? You see, Philip lived in that area, and he knew where all the supermarkets were, so it should be fairly easy for him to round up a few hundred loaves of bread and feed everybody. And I can imagine Jesus had just a bit of a twinkle in his eye as he told Philip, Philip, how about it? Well, Philip, of course, did just what a lot of us would have done, raised our hands and said, impossible. Well, he did a little more than that. He took out a piece of paper and he figured out, he said, did you ever think, Lord, what it will cost to feed all these people? And he begins figuring it out, and it ran into quite a bit of money for those days, and it would have taken quite a bit our day, too. How much does it cost to feed 10,000 people? Well, of course, Jesus had an answer. In fact, the Bible tells us that Jesus knew what he was going to do all the time. He was just kind of teasing Philip just a little bit to see what he would say. Then Jesus, of course, tells them all to sit down on the green grass. Apparently this was in the spring of the year. It was our privilege to be in Palestine just about this same time here a few months ago, time of the Passover. Beautiful green grass in that part of the country. In the summertime, you go now or in August, and you'll find it's all burned off just like Southern California, because they don't have much rain there in the summer either. But that time of year, beautiful green pasture land. So he says, now everybody sit down and we'll see what we can do about it. Well, you know what he did about it, of course. They found the 5 loaves and the 2 fishes. And he distributed this to the people, and it says they all ate and were satisfied, or as the King James says, they were all filled, and they were all feeling very comfortable, and then somebody got an idea. Now, taking care of their hunger was one thing, but to take care of that crowd when they were full, that was another thing entirely. And the suggestion was made, let's make him king, let's make him king, let's make him king. Jesus to be king, see? And they circulate this over these 12,000 people, and they're ready to force him to be king. Now, what to do? Another big problem. Some years before this, the devil had tried to do the same thing. He said, you be king. I'll give you the whole world. Here it is. Jesus turned it down then when the devil offered him the idea of rulership of the world. And he turns it down again when these people offer it to him. And then it's interesting to follow the story on after that. The Gospel of John is an interesting book in that it's constantly describing crises in the life of Christ. And this is another one. Desire of Ages entitles the chapter there on the crisis in Galilee. The people were very happy to have a Messiah that would feed them. They didn't want a Messiah that would challenge them. They were glad to have a Messiah that would distribute the loaves and fishes. They didn't want a Messiah that would die on the cross for their sins. And if you notice, reading through this 6th chapter, everything goes along beautifully. Everything's going Jesus' way until he says, I'm going to be crucified. I must give my life to save you people. And they said, we don't need it. We want you for a king. We don't want you to be crucified. We don't want you to die for us. We just want you to live for us as our king. And it says that then many deserted him. Many left him and went no more with him. And then you have him turning to Peter and saying to Peter, Peter, will you also go away? And then Peter's beautiful question, Lord, to whom shall we go? Well, thus far, we have some big things. We have a big crowd of people with a big appetite. We are involved with a big problem on how to feed them, which turns into a big proposition. Let's make him king. And this forces a big decision when Jesus says, no, thank you. Which culminated in a big rejection. From that time, many of them followed him no longer. Which then led to Peter's declaration, we're going to stay with you. Those are some of the big things. Now let's look at some of the little things in this story. You say 5,000 people, that's certainly not very little, no, but Jesus had an interesting technique of tackling big problems. He told them to sit down on the grass, but he divided them. One of the Gospels says in 50s and hundreds, the other Gospel says in 50s. He divided them all up in little groups. An interesting way to handle a situation. And when we're confronted with something that seems beyond us or too big for us to manage, it's a fine thing to do the same thing. Divide up the problem, separate it into its different compartments, and then tackle each part individually. When I was in Australia, I had a class of 160 students in one class. Now, of course, that's pretty good. Popular teacher, 160. The reason was they didn't have any other class at that time of day. That's really what happened. But anyway, over there they believe in essay examinations. The final examinations are all essay, and they write for 2 or 3 hours. And even if you don't know much, you can write for 2 or 3 hours if you want to fill up a paper. And so they have these examination books, about 13 pages in them, and of course the students, to impress the teacher, write, as much as they can, fill the book up. Probably this teacher goes by weight, who knows? And there you get a stack of papers about that high, 160 papers to read. That can take most of Christmas vacation doing that, and there's no fun to that. Well, that was what you had to do, wade through it. Well, I know what I used to do. I used to divide them up in groups of 10, and I'd tackle 10 at a time. I'd read 10, and I'd get up and get a drink, and walk around the block or something, come back, tackle another 10. It didn't reduce the number, but it just seemed to a little bit. It made it just a little bit easier to kind of group it in smaller sections. Many of our big problems could be handled that way, too. Eric Severoid who was a famous newscaster, of course, for many years. You probably heard him on TV. When he was 17-year-old, he and another fellow about the same age decided to go from Minneapolis, Minnesota, up to James Bay in Canada, right up through hundreds of miles of wilderness. Well, they got along all right for a while, and then they had about 450 miles left to go. And there was one little settlement in that whole 150 miles, and they were a bit timid. They wondered if we should go up there and all the grizzly bears and the wolves and what have you. We may get lost and all this, and it seemed like a long, long way. And then they met an old wood trapper up there. He'd been living in that country for many years. He says, fellows, he says, don't worry about the whole 450 miles. He says, just say, look, we've got 1 mile to go. 1 mile, and then another mile. Think of it as a mile at a time, and you'll make it all right. And of course they did. In fact, the Lord's Prayer reminds us of that, doesn't it? Give us this day our daily bread. Moment by moment I'm kept in his love. Moment by moment I've light from above. It's a moment by moment, day by day, step by step, mile after mile experience. And if we take it that way, the Lord sees us through. Well, Jesus divided up the crowd. The other little thing, of course, was the loaves and the fishes. Not very much, certainly. Not very much. In fact, it was Andrew, who raised that question. Somebody says, look, have we anything to eat? Well, he says, there's a boy here, and he has 5 loaves and 2 fishes, but what is that among so many? Rather silly to even start. Too small to be worth noticing. Well, this is a very human reaction. We're overwhelmed by our liabilities. We forget all about our assets. It reminds us a bit of the story of the 1-talent man. He looked at 5-talent Tom and 2-talent Tony, and he concluded in his self-evaluation test that he was only a 1-talent thing and he wasn't worth anything. He's a nameless sort of a creature. No one thinks I count for anything. Well, it was too bad that he thought that way, because I was checking on the value of that talent. Now, we're not sure whether that talent he had was a gold talent or a silver talent. But if it was a silver talent, even at the price of silver today, it'd have been worth about $8,300, which makes a fair start. And if it was a gold talent he had, it today would be worth about $360,000. I would say that if any of us had that much here today, we at least could say, well, I'll try, with $360,000 to start with. In fact, he had no reason whatever to feel that he was cut out for failure. His master must have had really a lot of confidence in him to entrust him with that. Even if it was just 1 talent, it was certainly a substantial amount and adequate to get off to a good start. Oh, it helps so much, really, or it should help to know that somebody has confidence in us. And this fellow's master had that. That somebody cares for us. That it matters to somebody how we get along. I was reading a story about a fellow who was shot down over the South Pacific Islands there somewhere during the Second World War. He landed on the coral reef a few miles off the coast of one of those islands by parachute, and he was kind of battered up a bit, but he wasn't killed. But he immediately felt so discouraged and so despondent, realizing that the enemy was over there on the island, as he thought, and that he probably knew already that he had landed here on this bit of a coral reef. They would be out with their boats, and they would torture him until he died. And he said, I might as well finish it now. And he picked up his revolver. He was going to shoot himself, and then he thought of his girlfriend back in America. She thinks a lot of me. She's just praying for the day when I come back. What a happy home we'll have if I ever get out of this thing alive. She has confidence in me. Oh, I can't let her down. What a thing. If she found out what happened, I just can't do that. I'll stick it through. I'll see. Take a chance. And it so happened that he fell into the hands of friends and eventually made it back to America. What made the difference? Somebody had confidence in him. Someone loved him. Somebody cared. That made all the difference. Well, this fellow with the talent could well have felt that way, even though he seemed not to have very much. Ask yourself, what are your assets? the chances are you have a lot going for you. Robert E. Bruce tells the story of being on New York City streets one time, and he heard somebody singing above the traffic and the din and noise of that city. He heard someone singing, and he found his way through the crowd, and finally he discovered there was a man in a wheelchair, and he looked at him closely, and he noticed he didn't even have any legs, and he said, "Well, mister," he says, you kind of cheer things up a bit with that singing here in the streets of New York. He says, "There must be something unusual about you." "Well," he says, "I'll tell you, mister." He says, "When I stopped looking at what I had lost and looked instead on what I still had, it made all the difference, and I'm so thankful for what God has given me." Moses, what do you have? "Well, not much. I got a rod. That's all." And think of what Moses did with his rod. "David, what do you have?" "Oh, I got 5 stones. 5 stones to kill a giant." "David, you got 4 too many. 1 will do it. You've already got more than you need." And yet we look at David, you don't have much. Well, he had all he needed and more. Well, what do we have? A few loaves and fishes, not very much, but with the blessing of God, what a difference it can make. It may be well, of course, for some of us to recognize our limitations just a bit. It's true we may not have a whole lot. Maybe what we have are only a few loaves and fishes, or maybe even some fragments. Reminds me of George Washington Carver, the black scientist. In his autobiography, he tells about asking the Lord for something big to do. "I want a big job. I want something really important, Lord. Give me something big." And the Lord said to him, "George, why don't you tackle something your own size? For instance, Lord, what? Oh, the peanut. Peanut. Work on the peanut for a few years," and of course, that's what Carver did and made a significant contribution in that area. I like what James Barrie says. "The forest would be a very quiet place if the only birds that sang were the ones that sing well. There's a place for the nightingale and the canaries, but Jesus had a lot to say about the sparrows. And maybe some of us are just sparrows, but we have a place in God's plan." Well, the loaves and the fishes, that was something else that was a bit small, sure enough. But then when we finish up with the story, of course, you have Jesus telling them to gather up the fragments, and that's getting even smaller. Just the fragments. Some lessons we can learn from this: certainly clean up the place. Don't leave a lot of scraps lying around. We could do well to have Jesus back in Palestine today. I was at the Sea of Galilee, and I wanted to take a picture. But I wanted it to look somewhat like it may have looked in the time of Christ. And before I could take my picture of that seashore there in the Sea of Galilee, I had to get rid of a bunch of pop bottles and tin cans and scraps of paper and who knows what. Jesus apparently believed in leaving the place like you got it, cleaning up. And so he says, we don't want to leave any scraps lying around. Of course, this was a tradition, really, among the Bedouins and those who traveled out in the desert. The archaeologists sometimes and other critics of the Bible have said, those Israelites, as they traveled out through the wilderness, how come we don't have any remains? We can't even prove that the Israelites journeyed here. There are no traces. They didn't leave any buildings. They didn't leave any scrap around. No broken pottery. No nothing. We can't be sure that the Israelites ever went through here except the Bible story. But it's a well-known fact that the Bedouins who travel in the desert, they take everything with them. They don't leave scraps behind. And the Bedouin camp may have been occupied for weeks and months, and when they move off with their tents, you wouldn't know that anyone had ever lived there. Well, Jesus thought that was a good idea too. He says, let's clean up this place. Don't leave a lot of scraps lying around. Another reason why you want to pick up the fragments, I'm sure, these leftovers, was to prove that they'd plenty to eat. Now, if there hadn't been anything left over, you might have thought, well, I bet there was some fellow didn't get enough to eat. We don't have a thing left. No. When you have people invited to dinner, you clean up everything. Boy, I wonder, did I have enough food? Everything's gone. If you have a few dishes that aren't quite finished, at least you can say, well, I guess it was enough. And so gathering up the fragments proved certainly that they had plenty to eat. In fact, they ended up with more than they had at the beginning. And that's the way Jesus always operates. I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. Grow old with me. The best is yet to be the last for which the first was made. That's the Jesus way of doing things. And then he wanted them to gather up the fragments to share with others back home. Not everyone had the privilege of enjoying that banquet that day, but Jesus wanted the folks back home. This afternoon, I wonder, wouldn't it be a nice thing if we drop by and see some shut in, somebody's been sick, somebody that needs a visit? Make a telephone call, take some of the blessings of Sabbath school and church back into the homes of these people that were not privileged to be here. Maybe there's a lesson for us there too in gathering up the fragments and sharing them with others back home. And then Jesus says, let's gather them up that nothing be wasted. No life that comes in contact with Jesus is ever wasted. The woman that had the 7 devils, you remember, looked like so much trash. Who wants to do anything with her? But Jesus cast out the devils and made her the first herald of the resurrection. That woman they were going to stone, certainly. She doesn't deserve any consideration. Trash, waste. Not for Jesus. He had the privilege of saving that soul. Anything committed to him is never wasted, be it our time, our talents, our treasure, whatever. Commit it to Christ. He has a place for it in his wonderful plan and purpose. Then getting the fragments together was something that the Lord wanted to do. Gather them together, put them in these baskets. Well, isn't this the way we do with some of the wonderful mosaics there are around the world? I was in Ravenna a few years ago in Italy. Those beautiful mosaics, the beautiful pictures, what are they made out of? Fragments, little pieces. But when they're all put together, what a beautiful masterpiece they are. We have today broken homes, shattered lives, shattered ambitions. As Robert Burns one time said, the best laid plans of mice and men gang aft gley. Yes, things get broken. They get fragmented. As Kipling said, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up again with worn-out tools. See, that's the challenge of putting the fragments together. There are broken homes through various emotional problems and just disintegration of love in the home. There are broken homes in which there is a vacant chair. I suppose most of us don't take too much time reading the obituaries in the newspaper, but every obituary tells a story of tears and sadness. Somebody's home is broken. I like the little story about Cornelius there in Acts, the 10th chapter. Remember when Peter came in, there were this vision that he had of the sheet and all the rest of it. They finally got together. And then as he comes into the home, Cornelius welcomes him in, and he says, now Peter, he says, we're all here together to listen to God's word. I think that's so nice. The entire family apparently was there to listen to Peter. That's one unique thing about Australia, as a matter of fact. Many of the early pioneers in Australia came into the church as entire families. In this country, we often had broken homes, part of the membership joined, but not the other. But over there, some of those strong pillars of the work in Australia came from those large families that joined as a unit the church. Well, I'm sure that's what the Lord wants. There are broken hearts, of course. Someone has said that we ought to be kind to everyone you meet because everybody you meet is having a hard time, and how true this is in life. Jesus does not promise, of course, to put it all back the way it was, but he says, I can use the pieces. Maybe some of you have read that article in the recent National Geographic on Saturn. I read over a couple of times. I was very intrigued by that. But Saturn, you know, is really one of the most beautiful sights in the heavens, and telescopes, thousands of people have looked at it through the centuries and admired those beautiful rings up there. Well, you know, we've sent a space probe up there to find out what the rings are made out of, and they're not very successful up to now, except they've discovered this, certainly, that those rings are made out of thousands of fragments, pieces. And God says, let's gather up the pieces. Now, where they came from, nobody knows, but they're up there. And instead of just cluttering up space, God, in his sense of beauty and wonder, builds rings around Saturn to adorn that beautiful planet up there in the skies. Well, that's the way God does with the pieces. He makes something beautiful out of them. When Mount St. Helens blew up here, you know, some months ago, I was reading an article in the paper about that. They said, what do you think will be the long-term effect of this? Well, of course, a lot of dust in the air. And this article went on to say, yes, but you know, that dust may give us some wonderful sunsets for the next few months. There again, God takes the dust from Mount St. Helens and vivifies, beautifies his sunsets, taking fragments to make things beautiful. We think of pieces, of course, in terms of that which is broken and ruined, but maybe we need to think more of pieces of thankfulness, pieces of gratitude, pieces of unselfishness, a few larger chunks maybe of love and understanding, fragments of forgetfulness even, that would consign to oblivion those bygone irritations that continue to annoy us. Maybe we need pieces of courage, pieces of determination, pieces of perseverance. Someone has well said that character can be measured by what it takes to stop us. You remember the story of Jim Whittaker, who was the first to get up on top of Mount Everest. And someone asked him up there in Nepal before they made the assault on the mountain, do you think you're going to make it? He says, yes, we're going to make it. You're sure about that? He says, yes, I'm sure about it. We're going to get to the top of Mount Everest. And they asked some of his associates there, you think you're going to make it? Well, we planned pretty well. We kind of hope we do. We're hopeful. Maybe we will. At least we're going to do our best. But Whittaker says we're going to do it. Perseverance. And of course, you know, they did it. A young fellow came to Abraham Lincoln one time and said, I want to be a lawyer. Got any suggestions for me? He says, if you got determination. He says, yes, I really want to be a lawyer. He said, well, he says, if you have a strong resolution, he says, you're halfway there already. He says, resolution is more important than any other asset you may need at this particular time. Well, of course, there are other fragments, and we might call them problems. One fellow came to Dr. Vincent Peale one time and said, I have problems. He says, I have problems. He says, I'm smothered with them. I'm drowned with all the problems I've got. And Vincent Peale says, I can tell you where you'll find 15,000 people that don't have any problems. He says, what? 15,000? No problem? Where are they? He says, up there in Woodland Cemetery. He says, that's where they are. He says, they don't have any problems. As long as you're living, you're going to have problems. Problems are a part of life. These difficulties, these shattered experiences, these broken hopes, these things that seem to disintegrate us sometimes, they can be challenges to us. I suppose at some time or other you've come across the story of Nathaniel Hawthorne. He walked home from his work one day and he was pretty discouraged and downcast because he'd been fired and he just didn't have a job. And he came in and he looked certainly woebegone and what's the matter? What's the matter? Oh, he says, I've just lost my job. He says, I don't know what we're going to do. Oh, she says, good. What? Oh, it's great. She says, now you'll be able to write your book. Oh, but he says, how are we going to live? He says, take a look. She pulled open a drawer in a dresser. She says, every time you brought your check home, she says, I've been putting a little money here. And she says, I've accumulated enough money here in this drawer to keep us going for about a year. So you don't need to worry. And that very day, Nathaniel Hawthorne sat down and began writing the Scarlet Letter. Tragedy? Sure. Problem? Yes. Opportunity. Well, those are some of the little things, the fragments, the loaves and the fishes. But there's another little thing in this story that we certainly must never neglect, and that's the little boy. The little boy. Because if the little boy hadn't been there, the whole story might have been different. What would Jesus have done if there had been no little boy there with 5 loaves and 2 fishes? Well, we don't know what he would have done. He would have certainly found an answer. But in this story, at least, the little boy is the answer. And I want to tell you a little story before we close, and this story is about Bobby, to illustrate the importance of a little boy. And Bobby's daddy was a railroad engineer. I read this story, by the way, in the Junior Guide a few years ago, and I've always enjoyed thinking about it again, because I have a brother-in-law who is a railroad engineer, retired now, and he was stationed in Mimico near Toronto, and also in Toronto. He was superintendent for that particular division for a number of years. But once in a while I had the privilege of riding with him in some of those locomotives. Particularly steam. A steam locomotive has some personality. These diesels, they're all right, they get you there. But the steam, boy, does it have something that the other can't. So, you know, get in one of those steam locomotives and open the throttle. Well, anyway, this fellow's daddy was an engineer on the railroad, and he, of course, had ridden with Daddy in the cab on a number of occasions. And on this particular occasion, Daddy was downtown there at the switching yard, and Bobby was at home, and their home was alongside the railroad track, out of town, up the hill a bit, several miles out of town. And Daddy was down there working away with the other men, and they were shunting engines and cars around, and somehow or other there was an engine sitting on the track with a full head of steam, but nobody on board, just sitting there. And as they pushed these cars around this shunting yard, somehow by mistake, a car came behind that engine and hit it. And it hit it with sufficient force that it opened the throttle just enough to start the engine going. And of course the men looked and they saw this engine, but they thought, oh well, I guess there's an engineer on board, it's all right, you know. But they saw it keep on going, and they saw it work through one switch after another and out and on to the main line. They said, what's the matter? Stop that engine, stop it! But who's going to stop it when there's nobody on board? And now it's already gaining a bit of speed and climbing up out of town, up past where Bobby was. Well, Bobby's daddy, he ran to the telephone. He said, son, he said, you there? Yes. Say, son, will you stop that locomotive as it comes by? How will I do that, Dad? He says, look, son, go out in the garage. He says, we have some old engine oil. Last time we changed the car oil. He says, it's out there. He says, take that can of oil and pour it on the railroad track, up one track and down the other, just as long as it'll last, see? Get the idea? Do it. Out he goes, grabs the can of oil, pours it up one track, down the other track, and just about that time he sees this locomotive coming right up the hill, right at him. Will it work? Will it work? And sure enough, it worked. When those big old drivers hit that oil, they just started spinning, and it slowed right down, and Bobby saw this big engine slowing down, and he says, I'll get up there, I'll take care of it. And up he climbs into the cab and shuts off the throttle and put on the brake and stopped it. But he had heard, his daddy had also told him there was a passenger train coming in on that main line in about 15 minutes. He says, I better not leave it here. Better do something about it. Pull the reverse lever, open the throttle, back her up right back into town. And sure enough, he comes riding on that locomotive right back into town. And the men, of course, see this locomotive coming and say, look at it, it's coming back. And sure enough, here it is. Hi, Dad, how are you? And young Billy calls from the cab and greets his dad, and you can be sure his dad was a pretty proud fellow as he saw what his boy Bobby had done. Only a boy. There's a lad here, but you know, what has he got? What are 5 loaves and 2 fishes among so many? But that boy, coupled with the ministry of Christ, solve the problem of the day. A whole nation is being crushed beneath the heel of dictatorial tyranny. What can we do? There's a boy here in a basket in the bulrushes. What's his name? Moses. The people are looking for a leader who will be strong and just and kind. Who can they find? Only a boy named David. Where can we find someone who will be willing to give his life to save a perishing race? Have you looked at Bethlehem? There's a boy there, and his name is Jesus. And so, friends, today, Jesus puts it all together. The crowd, the loaves and the fishes, the fragments, and the boy are all included in this wonderful picture that Jesus gives us that day. For us, the banquet of life may provide us with the bounties, the luxuries. We get a full-course meal. For some of us, we may only get the fragments. But remember that whatever we get, it has been first touched by the hands of Jesus before we ever touch it. Whatever experiences come to us with his blessing upon them. And so, we are reminded of those words from Beverly Shea's great song. He has the whole world in his hands. He has the sinner man in his hands. He has the tiny little baby in his hands. He has you and me in his hands. And so Jesus gets it all together for us. May we thank him today for his wonderful ministry on our behalf. Amen.